Okay, so let's talk about a pal for Gary. This episode is awful, and I don't think anyone disagrees. If you need proof, just look up all the reviews of this episode online. Everyone seems to hate this episode, and I can understand why. But what if this episode was good? I'm going to take what I think was supposed to be the ideas presented to this episode and try to make this a good episode. So pull out your scripts and let's start writing. Now the basic premise, from the looks of it, is that SpongeBob decides to get a second pet, meant to be a pal for Gary. And, hence the title. And that's just fine. But one thing that doesn't make sense is, why did they feel the need to have this monster creature that, according to SpongeBob Wikipedia, is called a nudibranch? So before we begin, let's change that to SpongeBob getting a pet worm. And if you can't figure it out immediately, I'll explain why in a bit when we get to that point in the episode. So, the episode starts off with SpongeBob feeding Gary, which is fine, I suppose, though there's really no need for that scene of SpongeBob tossing the can out and causing an extra mess. So, let's remove that scene. Now, after SpongeBob does that, he realizes, it's time for me to go to work. So, we're just going to reword the way he decides this and just maybe have him look at his watch or something to realize this. So, that's how we're going to have it go down. And this is where we're going to make one more slight change to what happens. Now, originally, Gary presents a leash to SpongeBob, implying that he wants to be walked. But instead, let's have him act a little bit more cat-like and have him rub up against SpongeBob's leg. Now, the reason why is because we want to emphasize that Gary, as a snail, is the underwater equivalent to a cat. And I myself am a cat owner, so I can tell you from experience, cats don't like to be walked. But they do love to rub themselves against people's legs. That's often how they say, I don't want you to leave, I really like you. So, that's just going to be a small tweak to make, just to make him act a bit more cat-like. So, at this point, SpongeBob promises Gary that he will be back after work and heads out. Now, the scene after where it shows that Gary is actually able to take care of himself and does that stupid lasso trick and watches TV, let's get rid of that scene, because it kind of contradicts itself and implies that Gary is just fine without him. So, we now establish that SpongeBob feels guilty about leaving Gary alone at his home, and he wants to make it up to him. So at work, a pet owner shows up with a pet worm. But we're going to make a small change to this character in the episode, and rather than him just being some stubborn pet owner that decides, I'm going to break the rules about bringing animals into a restaurant. So instead, we're going to make this guy blind. That way, we get a bit of a unique way of portraying the pet worms as, being seeing eye worms in place of dogs. And it gives him a valid reason to bring a pet inside a restaurant, because most restaurants do have a rule that says no pets allowed, but they do always make an exception if it's an assistant dog, which in this case it would be. So, SpongeBob is intrigued about the blind man's pet and asks him about the worm. And of course, the blind man happily tells SpongeBob about how great worms are and that, they're great companions, man's best friend, the sort of stuff a typical dog owner would say about their dog, but in this case, talking about a worm instead. So, of course, being that worms are the equivalent to dogs, this makes sense. And after hearing all these great things about worms, SpongeBob decides, what? I think I would like to get a worm myself. It would make a great pal and companion for Gary so that while I'm gone, I won't feel bad because Gary will have someone to keep him company. So, with that in mind, that scene with Mr. Krabs talking about responsible pet ownership and afterwards trying to get SpongeBob to stay to pave the driveway or whatever, let's get rid of both of those parts because neither of them are necessary. In fact, we don't even need Mr. Krabs in the episode at all. Kind of pointless to have him around. So we're going to remove both of those since they're pointless filler. So now comes the part where we make the big change. Now, as we know in the real episode, SpongeBob visits a gypsy lady or something like that to buy that nudibranch creature, who of course ends up being a total monster, which of course the gypsy person warns about. But we're going to replace that with SpongeBob visiting a normal pet shop. You know, nothing special, no weird gypsy curses or anything strange like that. It's just a regular, ordinary, or at least by SpongeBob standards, pet shop. Now, we can even have a bit of fun with this, since we don't really have any specific rules on this. Let's have the person working at the pet shop be something comedic. You know, maybe have him be a surfer dude or a teenager or, you know, something silly. But I'll let you guys decide what exactly. And so anyway, SpongeBob goes in. The pet shop owner says something funny or acts all goofy upon greeting him. And then SpongeBob asks the owner for a pet worm. And here, the pet shop owner says how great worms are as pets, and takes SpongeBob to a cage containing a rather friendly worm. The worker shows him that not only are worms really friendly, but they can do tricks, and, you know, gives a few commands, and the worm obeys them, and then has SpongeBob give them, just to indicate that, yeah, this worm is clearly a dog, and he's highly obedient and friendly. You know, typical dog behavior. Now, as you can see from this, the worm being a dog is made obvious, and if you haven't guessed yet, I'll tell you why. Because in SpongeBob world, Gary, who is a snail, is considered the equivalent to a cat. So this means that by getting a worm, which is a dog, we can go with a good dog versus cat conflict, which honestly is one that hasn't really been used much in SpongeBob, other than in that one episode that honestly sucked. So with this, SpongeBob decides he wants this worm, and he tells the guy that the worm would make a great friend for Gary. But the pet shop owner asks about Gary, and SpongeBob says, "Oh, yeah, Gary's my pet snail." Immediately, the owner advises against getting this worm, saying that snails and worms don't get along. By the way, this explanation should include the sounds of some barking and meowing to emphasize the fact that this is about cats and dogs. Anyway, SpongeBob ignores the warning and insists that Gary is very friendly and will get along with the worm just fine. He even maybe looks at the cheerful worm and asks if he'll be okay with the snail, and of course the worm continues to be cheerful and enthusiastic about the idea. So the shop owner reluctantly sells SpongeBob the pet worm, and SpongeBob goes home. SpongeBob comes home with his pet worm, who, feel free to have him give some silly name to this worm, like something silly or ridiculous, or heck, can even call him Puffy Fluffy, just like SpongeBob ended up calling the monster creature, because honestly, Puffy Fluffy would be appropriate of a name for a worm. So anyway, he calls Gary over, and at this point, we know that cartoon logic states that cats and dogs are not allowed to get along, for the most part. Often it will go one of several ways. Either the dog will start chasing the cat will be mean to the dog, or of course they'll start fighting. And we're going to go with the first option of the chasing scenario. So, being that he's a worm, he starts to chase Gary around. And of course, Gary hides behind SpongeBob. SpongeBob tells the worm to behave, and the worm stops chasing Gary. SpongeBob tells the two of them that they're going to need to get along from now on, and tells them he's going to go upstairs to take a nap, or something like that. Basically, we gotta get him out of the way for a moment. Now, as soon as SpongeBob is out of the picture, Gary tries to make peace with the worm, but the worm starts attacking Gary aggressively. Gary fights back, hissing and meowing loudly, and SpongeBob hears the screaming and decides to start walking downstairs to take a look. Now, in real life, dogs have really good hearing, so it's not unreasonable to have the worm hear SpongeBob walking down the steps. So upon hearing the footsteps, he stops attacking Gary, but Gary, who doesn't have that kind of hearing, continues hissing at the worm and maybe even tries to attack back. SpongeBob, upon showing up, sees that Gary is attacking the worm, who, upon seeing SpongeBob, pretends to be the victim and even maybe hides behind SpongeBob, pretending to whimper and cower just to, show that he's pretending that he's afraid. Now, because SpongeBob didn't realize the worm was tricking him, this makes SpongeBob getting mad at Gary justified. And of course, SpongeBob, understandably, gets angry at Gary and tells him that he needs to behave. So, this way, the worm convinces SpongeBob that he was of this trick and it doesn't make him unlikable. So, the next thing is that after SpongeBob steps away again, the behavior continues to take place where the worm continues to bully Gary. And by the way, it should be noted that the amount of fighting that takes place should not cause any serious collateral damage. Like, I don't want to see any fires, no serious property damage like that monster caused, because honestly, he's just a worm, so he shouldn't really do anything worse than maybe tear up the furniture or rip a book apart, dog behavior. So anyway, fight continues, and, the worm once again tricks SpongeBob into thinking Gary is being bad. And SpongeBob gets increasingly mad at Gary for this. So maybe have this take place another 2 times maybe or something. Anyway, so eventually the fighting gets so bad that they're screaming loudly at each other to a point where the worm doesn't even hear SpongeBob noticing. And SpongeBob hears the sound, walks down, but as I said, the worm doesn't even hear that SpongeBob is walking down the steps because he's so busy barking at Gary, who is hissing at him. And so eventually, SpongeBob does walk in and finally catches the worm red-handed attacking Gary. Now, this time, of course, SpongeBob sees what happens, and upon the worm realizing that SpongeBob is right there, he tries to pretend to be the victim once again. But this time, SpongeBob doesn't fall for it. Because, he saw what happened and realizes the truth. So, SpongeBob apologizes to Gary for not believing him, but now the problem is that SpongeBob has a pet worm that he can't keep. But luckily, the door knocks and it turns out to be the pet owner from earlier who is here to take the worm back. But SpongeBob asks the guy if the worm will find a new home, and he is assured that the worm already has a new home, and then reveals that the blind guy at the restaurant has actually decided that he wants to get a second worm, because he loves them so much that he would like to get another one. So the worm goes over to the blind man and the worm he already owns, and maybe the 2 worms sniff each other's butts or something, or whatever the worm equivalent to that would be, basically to show that they do get along. So the worm leaves with them, and with this, SpongeBob is now alone with Gary, and he asks if he's going to be alright being alone from now on. And Gary gives a happy meow, and SpongeBob and Gary hug. And that's the end of the episode. So, let's go over why this works better than what was presented. For starters, there is really no reason to have SpongeBob getting some gypsy creature as a play pal for Gary when the cat and dog dynamic can be used instead. It also makes SpongeBob less of an idiot if he sees them fighting because the worm isn't going to transform into some hideous beast that tears the place up in ways that Gary couldn't possibly cause. So it makes the damage Gary did believable. Not only that, but it also keeps this creature, in this case the worm, from being entirely unlikable because, he's a dog. And that's kind of what dogs do when they see cats, is they kind of tend to fight. It's not unlikable, and it doesn't make the worm entirely hated, and it doesn't make Gary unlikable at all. So, it kind of works out. So, that wraps up how I would fix a pal for Gary. If you have some ideas on how you would do this episode, leave a comment below on your version.